Good morning, class. Today we are going to be going over the next lesson in our World War I unit, when Turkey enters the war. Especially what's important about this subject is it's highlighting the tragedy of the Armenian Genocide of 1915. More specifically, we'll be breaking up this lesson into 3 sections: before, during, and after the genocide. First, we'll be introducing factors related to the genocide. Second, we'll be covering events of the genocide. Third, we'll be explaining how World War I offered a smokescreen in making it possible. Fourth, we'll highlight the current events related to it in Turkey. And lastly, we will be discussing solutions to prevent more of these from occurring again. So, moving on, pre-genocide. So with that, we're going to set up the stage for what led to the genocide, what factors led to that. And we must first recognize Armenians' standing in the Ottoman Empire. Starting in the 1300s, they were considered, and still were till the end, a second-class Malay. Essentially what a Malay system is the granting of local jurisdiction over the non-Muslim groups in the majority Muslim empire. So for instance, the Armenian Christians had the opportunity to practice their own faith, however, under the stipulation of paying an additional tax, unlike their Muslim counterparts. So from the very get-go, we have the foundation that they are not equals in this society. Moving on and fast-forwarding to the 19th century, in the 1800s, we have the arrival of American missionaries. What's interesting about this and what is problematic, not that they're coming, but the fact that the Turkish government actually banned any involvement of these missionaries with the Muslim groups. And that's understandable. They don't want to lose their faith. They want to preserve it. However, what the issue is that because of this isolation on non-Muslim groups such as the Armenian Christians, we see the incorporation of their universities and their hospitals as a form of rapidly socially mobilizing these people far greater than their Muslim counterparts. And knowing Americans and their education, we're going to have more democratic principles. So this leads to the Armenians actually demanding equal rights for once. And unsurprisingly, this creates a lot of conflict. And we can see this through the Turkish response of the Hamidian massacre of the 1890s and the Adana massacre of 1909. And just to give you some reference for the rest of the lecture, the first map on the left-hand corner is the Ottoman Empire before its collapse in the 1920s, and that little red area is the concentration of Armenians generally. And then the map to your, on the bottom right, we have modern-day Turkey, and still you see that kind of small circling of red. That's where the Armenians still are today, for the most part. And for our purposes, we will want to make sure we recognize that Russia is to the northeast and Syria to the south, which will be highlighted further down. Now moving on to the genocide. So the Armenian genocide began with Turkey's entrance into the war on November 2nd, 1914. Naturally with this, any country is going to pool its resources together in order to fight. So the first thing that we see that is not very radical from an outsider's point of view is the drafting of Armenian men and confiscation of their weapons. Sadly, a lot of these men are strategically put on the front lines, and many of them are killed. And at the same time, these communities are now vulnerable, as they do not have the arms to protect themselves as they once did. This kind of transitions us into the ability for them to pass the temporary law of deportation of May 1915. This was the short-term notice that Armenians had to evacuate their communities. Now without fathers or any arms, they had no choice but to conform to what the Turkish government was telling them to do. So now with grandmothers and mothers as the new head figures of the family, they were scrambling just to prepare and pack up as much food and supplies as they could carry with them on this unknown journey. Something very sad about this is that they were marched out to the Syrian desert, which, as we mentioned before, was to the south of Turkey. Along this journey, we have people shot dead, just for no apparent reason, just shot dead. We also have Armenians being kidnapped for sex slavery and labor. And those remaining that are not killed by the shootings or kidnapped are sent out forcefully to their death, unclothed, starving, thirsty, and sick, under the hot summer sun of the Syrian desert. And for those not killed in either of the first 2 points I mentioned, there were church burnings. These communities were huddled together like cows in their church, and and Turkish soldiers surrounded the outside, ready and armed for anyone who would try to leave in a church that they would set ablaze. All of this leads to a crazy death total of 1.5 million. And the interesting thing about this is that 1.5 million doesn't sound like a lot in today's standards with our mega cities, such as New York, being 8 million. However, this is half their population. There's no doubting that this is a genocide. And as shown by these pictures, we have the Armenian church, that tiny one to the top. That's where they would be huddled and burned alive. And then these 2 other larger pictures, you can see the Armenians walking along through the desert, having to just no time to mourn the lost loved ones that they were losing along the way. Very sad. And even more so, we have just imagine hundreds of thousands of these people coming out of these communities without any choice. And the even saddest part of this reality is this picture to the left is this Turkish official taunting these starving Armenians with bread. They're so hungry. It's so sad. Now, moving on to how World War I was able to offer us, the world, a smokescreen to the atrocities happening, we first must look at the Triple Entente, which is France, Britain, and Russia. Among others, Italy and Belgium. What was happening is, on the Western Front, you had Belgium totally occupied, France partially occupied, so they were busy with that. On the Eastern Front, you have Russia just getting bombarded and bombarded. Russia in itself was not technologically as advanced as the others. And then Britain on the sidelines, they're splitting their resources thin just by trying to reinforce both the Eastern and Western Front fighters. So as you can imagine, not only were they busy trying to keep Germany under control as things escalated, but they were also financially strapped, as can be shown in this financial table. And not that we're going to go through all of them, but just looking at the top one, UK. The UK spent the most. In 1918, by the end of the war, they had spent $35 billion. And that was then. Translating that to today's dollars, that is $663 billion. That is a lot. That is more than $500 billion. And that's pretty common for today's debt, as being the trillion. So not only were they bombarded with just trying to protect their own citizens and keep Germany under control, but they were also, their eyes were just preoccupied with this debt. Moving on, another interesting thing that we can see with this smokescreen is through the relationship between Turkey and Germany. Specifically, Turkey benefited Germany in its geographic positioning, specifically with the Dardanelles Strait. This was the bridge between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean Sea. And what was important about this is that France was on the shore of the Mediterranean, and they had the opportunity to actually supply soldiers and weapons to Russia, as I mentioned before, was technologically lacking in advancement of all that stuff. So what Turkey was able to do was blockade any support to that, because they connected both the Black and the Mediterranean. The Black Sea would take you to Russia. So because of this, Germany basically felt obligated to keep quiet about these atrocities. So they both helped each other. Turkey with blocking off supplies, and Germany by keeping quiet about the mass murdering of Armenians. And to help highlight this a little bit better, here we see France. They could have shipped off their supplies to the Mediterranean all the way through here to the Dardanelles, to the Black Sea, and then Russia to the far corner next to Ukraine. However, because of that, as we mentioned earlier, there was no possibility because of Turkey's strategic positioning in the war. And lastly, we can further see how World War I was used as an excuse for the murder of 1.5 million Armenians. Reason number one, in the Istanbul trials, it was conveyed that it was to end conflict between Christians and Muslims. Although there was no evidence of this happening, of Armenians committing religious hate crimes against Muslims, they used this as a tactic to kill them, as a reason to kill them. Because if you think about it, a country that's trying to go to war, they don't have time to focus on internal problems. They have to get rid of that. Otherwise, it's going to take focus off of their main objective, is aiding others in war. So because of this, they reason why they did this. Reason number two, as we mentioned earlier, is Armenians were needed on the front lines. Naturally, during a war, you're going to pull all of your resources together, which includes soldiers, men, and they use that as another reason why they killed the Armenians. And then reason number three, punishing pro-Russian Armenian traitors. This relates to the Armenian soldiers drafted to fighting the Russians on the northeastern side of the country, as we mentioned earlier in that map. The reason that they call them pro-Russian Armenians is because they refused to fight those neighbors to the north of that border, which were their own people, Armenians. So the Turkish officials saw this as betrayal, thus a need to kill them in order to maintain order. Post-genocide. And just to add to the human impact just beyond death, but also the impact emotionally on these Armenians, the ones that did survive, here's a video of a survivor in his testimony.
Sometimes people say we lost 1.5 million Armenians perished. But I think the calamity is much more serious than that. Even those of us who did survive, we lost something very precious, something which is the birthright of every person. Childhood. We lost our childhood. And even now, I have nightmares about it. Sometimes people...
Okay, and tying this into a history replay, we have the current Kurdish-Turkish conflict that began in the late 1970s. Through this, we have the ban of the Kurdish language in 1980. We have obvious, planned out, targeted airstrikes against specific Kurdish communities. And we also have an overrepresentation of Kurds in the political prison system, those who are resisting the atrocities happening to them from the Turkish government. And this reflects really what happened to Armenians in the 19 teens. Then it was the Turkish government religiously cleansing the system of non-Muslims. They had a pan-Islamist agenda. Now fast forwarding to the later part of the 19th century, or 20th century, we have an even more extreme agenda, which is not just religious, but now ethnically homogenous society. Turks only, no one else. Thus, Kurds are now the next Armenians in Turkey. And as we can see, this is a insurgent group of Kurds who are fighting to pull away from Turkey to create their own nation state, as they propose would be called Kurdistan. In the picture to the far left is the tragedies that are happening, the impacts on these Kurds. Okay, quick recap. So first of all, we need to realize that the factors that led to this genocide began with the foundation that Armenians were never seen as equals from the very get-go. Secondly, they had social advances through the arrival of American Christian missionaries in the 19th century, through their education in hospitals and development, bringing democratic principles, thus incentivizing them to demand equal rights. Moving on to the genocide part of this lesson, the events included drafting Armenian men, confiscating weapons for the war effort, which then led to the vulnerability that would allow the Turkish government to easily deport them without any major resistance. And just for pure evil, set aside certain communities just to burn them in their own churches alive. And third, going through World War I cover-ups. What was it that allowed this genocide not to be made aware of by the rest of the international community? This can be seen both through the distracted allied groups who were preoccupied fighting the war with Germany and just trying to keep up with their aggressions, and also dealing with their own financial problems of investing in this war, and also of the evil obligations between Turkey and Germany. Turkey providing Germany with the blockade of French forces supplying Russian forces from the Mediterranean through the Dardanelles to the Black Sea to Russia. They were able to block this, which was beneficial to Germany. Thus, Germany felt obligated to return the favor by keeping quiet of the atrocities in Armenia. Moving on to post-genocide, current events. This is the Kurdish-Turkish conflict that began in the 1970s, which reflects what happened to the Armenians and what could happen if things are not checked upon with the Turkish government. And lastly, I'm sorry, I somehow missed this, but we should have gone through the genocide solutions. I don't know why it didn't go through, but we'll go over it just now, just to, give you the chance. So first, we need to have an awareness of these minorities in these countries that are specifically vulnerable. We need to also consider the possibility of making nation sites, setting aside land for these specific ethnic/religious groups, which can be paralleled to the Israel state formed in the 1940s and the Armenian state formed in the 1920s. Third, we need to punish these governments who are working within these types of acts. Turkey was never punished. They still deny it to this day. That's an issue. We need to address that. And lastly, we need to educate students. Me personally, I never learned about the Armenian genocide. I never had even heard of it. And when you don't know about these things, there's nothing you can do about it. So that's what we learned about today. And I thank you for all of your time.